the waiting dot, the dawn light filters through the paper windows, and you've already been awake for hours, listening for footsteps that won't come today or perhaps for months. You sit in the smallest courtyard of your home, the one reserved for quiet moments, where a single plum tree stretches its branches toward the sky. The air is cool, carrying the scent of incense from the Buddhist temple 3 streets away, mixing with the earthier smells of the city waking, wood smoke from cooking fires, the distant sweetness of steaming baozi from the street vendors who are already setting up their stalls, the faint mustiness of the canal that runs behind the merchant quarter, your silk robes a deep blue that your husband brought back from his last journey, dyed with indigo that traveled all the way from somewhere beyond the western deserts, feel heavy on your shoulders. Or perhaps it's not the robes at all. Perhaps it's simply the weight of another day beginning without him. It has been 7 months since he left. 7 months since you stood at this same spot, watching his caravan assemble in the gray pre-dawn, watching him check and recheck the loads on each camel, watching him embrace you briefly, always too briefly before mounting his horse. 7 months since you watched the long line of men and animals disappear down the wide avenue that leads westward out of Chang'an, toward the gates, toward the mountains, toward the deserts and cities whose names you can pronounce but whose realities you can only imagine. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, places that exist for you only in the objects he brings back and the stories he tells when he's had enough wine to soften the edges of memory. You tell yourself that 7 months is nothing unusual. His journeys typically last anywhere from 6 months to a year and a half, depending on the route, the weather, the political situations in the kingdoms and territories between here and there. Sometimes longer if opportunities arise. A local ruler wants to purchase the entire stock of silk. If a business partnership needs to be solidified with weeks of negotiation and ceremony. If the winter snows close the mountain passes and the caravan must wait in some foreign city until spring. You've learned not to count days too carefully. You've learned that the counting itself can become a kind of madness, a way of willing time to move faster when time moves at its own pace, regardless of your wishes. But still, you listen. Every morning, you listen for the sound of runners coming with news. The merchant guilds maintain a network of messengers who travel faster than the caravans themselves, carrying letters, updates, warnings of dangers on the roads. When a runner arrives at the guild house 2 streets away, you usually know within the hour. The other wives send their servants, or sometimes come themselves, to share whatever news has arrived. You've all developed a language for this. A way of reading each other's faces to know whether the news is good or simply mundane updates about delays and route changes. A runner came with news from Dunhuang, the great oasis city at the edge of the desert. Several caravans had gathered there, waiting for the right season to attempt the crossing to the next oasis. Your husband's caravan was mentioned. They were well. They had sold some goods and acquired others. They were planning to wait another 2 weeks before departing. The news was already a month old by the time it reached you. Carried across mountains and plains by a series of runners, each passing the information to the next, which means that by now, if all went according to plan, they should already be deep in the Taklamakan desert. that terrible stretch where water is scarce and sandstorms can bury a caravan in hours. You try not to think about it. You've become very good at not thinking about certain things. Instead, you think about what needs to be done today. The household doesn't stop simply because its master is absent. In fact, in many ways, your responsibilities multiply when he's gone. You are not simply a wife waiting patiently for her husband's return. You are the manager of a complex business operation, the head of a household with 17 servants, the keeper of storerooms filled with valuable goods, the maintainer of relationships with suppliers and buyers and other merchant families. You are the one who makes the decisions that keep this enterprise running. Who negotiates prices? Who judges character? Who knows when to trust and when to be cautious? Your mother-in-law would have done all this once, but she died 3 years ago during a summer when the heat was particularly fierce and some kind of fever swept through the city. You had been married for 5 years at that point, and she had been teaching you, gradually passing on the knowledge you would need. But her death came suddenly, and you found yourself thrust into full responsibility sooner than anyone expected. You were 24 years old. Some days you felt ancient. Other days you felt like a child playing at being grown. Now you are 27. And the weight of these responsibilities has settled into something familiar, if not exactly comfortable. You know the rhythms of the household, the patterns of the business, the networks of relationships that sustain everything. You know which silk merchants in the city can be trusted, and which ones water down their goods with inferior thread. You know which officials need to be cultivated with gifts and careful courtesy, and which ones are honest enough to simply do their jobs without elaborate social rituals. You know how to read account books, how to calculate profit margins, how to spot when a servant is stealing, and how to handle it in a way that maintains order without creating resentment. You stand. Finally, because sitting still has become unbearable. The plum tree's branches sway slightly in the morning breeze, and a few late blossoms cling to the wood, their petals pale pink against the gray bark. Soon they'll fall, and then the tree will focus on growing fruit, those small sour plums that your cook makes into preserves. Everything in its season, everything in its time. This is what you tell yourself anyway. This is how you make it through the waiting. From somewhere in the compound, you hear the sounds of the household stirring. The servants who sleep in the back buildings are emerging, beginning their morning routines. Soon someone will bring you tea, probably Lotus, the servant who has been with you since you married into this family, who knows your habits and moods well enough to anticipate your needs. Soon the day will fill up with tasks and decisions and the 1,000 small things that make up a life. Soon you will be too busy to stand in courtyards, listening for footsteps that won't come. But for now, in this quiet moment between night and day, you let yourself feel it, the loneliness, the worry, the strange pride you take in managing all of this alone. The love you still feel for a man who is more absence than presence in your life. The resignation that this is what you chose, or what was chosen for you, or some complicated mixture of both. This is your life, waiting and working, working and waiting, holding everything together across the distances that commerce demands. The sky is lightening now, turning from gray to a pale gold. Somewhere far to the west, your husband is waking to war. Perhaps he's already been awake for hours, checking his caravan, calculating distances and dangers, thinking of home. Or perhaps he's not thinking of home at all. Perhaps he's thinking about prices and profits, about the next city, about the road ahead. You've learned not to romanticize his thoughts. You've learned that survival requires focus, and focus often means setting certain feelings aside. A bird calls from the plum tree, a sharp, clear note that seems to cut through your reverie. You take a breath, pulling the silk robes more closely around yourself, even though the morning isn't truly cold. It's time to begin. Time to be who you need to be, the merchant's wife, the household manager, the woman who holds everything together. The waiting will continue, but it will happen alongside everything else. Woven through your days like a thread through fabric, present, but not always visible. Essential to the pattern even when you're not looking directly at it. You turn toward the house, toward the day that's waiting, toward all the decisions and duties and small dramas that will fill the hours, until night falls again and you return to this courtyard. This listening, this vigil that has no clear end. This is your life on the Silk Road, not the journey itself, but the space between journeys, the home that makes the traveling possible, the stillness that anchors the movement. And you will do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. For as long as the roads call him away and bring him home again, your world, the merchant. Quarter of Chang'an. But let's step back for a moment and walk through the wooden gates of your home, into the world you've built while he's been gone. Let's see what your life actually looks like, day to day. In this corner of Chang'an, where merchants from every corner of the known world have made their home. Because understanding your waiting requires understanding what you're waiting within, the physical and social landscape that shapes every hour of your existence. Your home sits in the western district of Chang'an, in a neighborhood where the air itself seems to carry whispers of distant places. The Tang capital is the largest city in the world. Over 1 million people living within its walls and spreading into the suburbs beyond. And nowhere is its cosmopolitan nature more evident than here. In the merchant quarter, the streets around your compound are a tapestry of languages and faces, of architectural styles that blend Chinese sensibilities with foreign influences, of shops and warehouses and homes that speak to the vast networks of trade that have made this city wealthy beyond measure. Walk out your front gate on any given morning, and you'll hear Sogdian being spoken in sharp, rapid syllables from the warehouse across the street, where a family from Samarkand stores bales of cotton and bags of precious stones. Turn left, and you'll pass a wine shop run by a Persian family, 3 generations of them now living in Chang'an, though they still maintain the Zoroastrian fire temple on the edge of the district. Turn right, and you'll encounter the Arab traders who deal in frankincense and myrrh, their Chinese wives bargaining in the market with an accent that blends their husbands' languages with the local dialect. The morning air carries the scent of cumin and coriander from someone's kitchen, mixing with the smell of Chinese medicinal herbs being prepared next door, blending with the smoke from incense that might be sandalwood from India or argarwood from Southeast Asia. Your own compound reflects this mixture of worlds. The architecture is fundamentally Chinese, a series of buildings arranged around courtyards, following the principles of harmony and hierarchy that have governed such spaces for centuries. But look closer, and you'll see the influences your husband has brought home over the years. The deep blue tiles on one section of roof came from somewhere in Persia, their glaze more brilliant than anything produced locally. The carved wooden screens that divide one courtyard from another incorporate patterns he saw in Central Asian palaces, designs that speak to Islamic aesthetics even as they're executed by Chinese craftsmen. The garden in the main courtyard includes plants that aren't native to China, a pomegranate tree that produces fruit with jewel-like seeds, rose bushes that bloom with an intensity of color and fragrance unknown in traditional Chinese gardens. The main gate opens onto a reception courtyard, a semi-public space where business can be conducted without allowing outsiders into the more private areas of the compound. This is where your husband meets with partners and customers when he's home, where contracts are negotiated and deals are sealed. Even in his absence, you use this space for the same purposes, though you're always aware of the different dynamics at play when a woman conducts business rather than a man. The courtyard is paved with gray stone, kept meticulously swept by the servants. Stone lions, smaller than those that guard imperial buildings, but impressive nonetheless, flank the inner doorway, their mouths open in eternal roars, their eyes alert to all who enter. Beyond the reception courtyard lies the heart of the compound, the main residential courtyard, where the family's living quarters are located. Your rooms occupy the north side, the position of honor, with windows that look out onto a carefully tended garden. Your husband's study is adjacent to your chambers, a room lined with shelves holding account books, maps, and the occasional precious manuscript. He's literate in Chinese and can read some Sogdian skills that are essential in this business. You're literate too, though your education came later, after marriage, when your mother-in-law recognized that you'd need to read and write to manage the business effectively. You remember those lessons, the hours spent practicing characters, the way your hand would cramp from holding the brush, the growing satisfaction as the symbols became meaningful rather than merely decorative. The eastern and western sides of this courtyard house, the servants' quarters, or, at least, the quarters of the senior servants who are trusted enough to live in the main compound. Lotus has a room on the east side, along with cook and the head steward, old Chen, who has been with your husband's family for 30 years and knows more about the business than most of the merchants themselves. The younger servants, the ones who do the heavy work of carrying and cleaning, live in the outer buildings, closer to the kitchen and storerooms. And the storerooms, these are perhaps the most important spaces in the entire compound. They occupy the southern section, a series of large, windowless buildings with thick walls and heavy locks. This is where your husband's wealth actually resides, transformed from silver into goods, waiting to be transformed back into silver, hopefully at a profit. Walking through the storerooms is like walking through a museum of the world's treasures, except everything here is for sale. Everything is part of the endless cycle of acquisition and disposal that defines merchant life. One room holds bolts of silk in every grade and color imaginable. Raw silk that still needs to be processed, white silk ready for dyeing, finished silks in colors that seem to glow even in the dim light that filters through the doorway, crimson and gold, deep purple and delicate pink. Patterns of flowers and clouds and dragons worked with a skill that makes each bolt a work of art. Silk is what China is known for. what the entire trade route is named after. And your husband deals primarily in this precious fabric. But he's smart enough to diversify, to trade in other goods as well, to not risk everything on a single commodity. Another storeroom contains ceramics porcelain, so fine you can see light through it. Celadon, with its distinctive jade-green glaze, sturdy pottery for everyday use. These are produced in kilns scattered across China, and your husband buys them in bulk to sell in Western markets where Chinese ceramics are prized as exotic luxuries. You've learned to evaluate quality, to spot the tiny flaws that might make a piece unsuitable for sale to discriminating buyers, to understand which styles appeal to which markets. A third room holds the goods your husband brings back from the West. Glassware from Roman territories, though Rome itself is so distant and fragmented that it's more legend than reality from your perspective. The glass is remarkably clear and colorful, worked into shapes that Chinese craftsmen can't duplicate. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, deep blue stones shot through with gold flecks, ground into powder for pigments or carved into jewelry. Pearls from the Persian Gulf, carpets from Central Asia, their patterns and colors speaking to aesthetic traditions completely different from Chinese sensibilities. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, each one worth its weight in silver to the right buyer. You know every item in these storerooms. You conduct regular inventories, checking quantities against the account books, making sure nothing has been stolen or damaged by moisture or pests. You make decisions about when to sell and at what price, about which goods to hold in anticipation of market changes, about which items to give as gifts to maintain important relationships. This knowledge didn't come easy. In your first year of managing the business alone, you made mistakes, sold too cheaply, held too long, misjudged a buyer's sincerity. But you learned. The lessons were expensive, but you learned. The compound also includes a kitchen complex in the far southern corner, designed to keep cooking fires away from the main buildings. The kitchen is Cook's domain, and she rules it with an authority that rivals your own. She's been with the family almost as long as old Chen, and she knows how to prepare dishes that range from traditional Chinese cuisine to the exotic foods that your husband developed a taste for during his travels. Sometimes, when you're feeling particularly lonely or restless, you go to the kitchen and ask her to teach you something new. She's always surprised. Women of your status don't usually spend time cooking, but she's never refused. There's something soothing about the repetitive work of chopping vegetables, about the immediate cause and effect of ingredients becoming food, about creating something that will be consumed and appreciated within hours rather than months beyond your own compound. The merchant quarter stretches in all directions, a neighborhood that functions almost as a city within the city. The guilds maintain their own buildings, meeting halls where merchants gather to share information, to resolve disputes, to organize collective action when needed. There's a market that operates daily, where smaller traders sell goods that don't warrant an entire warehouse. There are restaurants and tea houses where business is conducted over meals, where deals are made and broken, where rumors spread faster than official news. And there are the temples, Buddhist temples, primarily, because Buddhism has become the faith that transcends cultural boundaries, that allows Chinese and foreigners to worship together, even when they can't fully communicate. But there's also the Zoroastrian fire temple. And you've heard there's a small community of Nestorian Christians who meet in a private home, and even a few Jewish merchants who gather for their own rituals. Chang'an is a city that accommodates difference, that profits from diversity, that understands wealth flows along the same channels as tolerance. This is your world, bounded by the compound walls in some ways, but connected to vast networks of trade and culture that span continents. You live in one place, but that place is shaped by everywhere. You manage a household, but that household is a node in a system that moves goods and ideas and people across deserts and mountains and seas. Your daily life is domestic, but domesticity here means something different, something larger than it might in a farming village, or even in a scholar official's urban residence. You are embedded in global commerce, even as you never leave the city. You are connected to distant lands, even as you remain always here. The business you manage the morning after a sleepless night. You sit in your husband's study with the account books spread before you, and you realize something that would surprise most people who don't know your world. You're not just waiting passively for his return. You're running a business, not helping with it, not maintaining it in his absence, actually running it, making the decisions that determine whether this family thrives or fails, whether the wealth continues to grow or begins to erode. This truth would shock many people in Chang'an, especially those in the scholar official class who imagine merchants' wives as decorative figures, confined to inner chambers. But here, in this practical world of trade and profit, reality demands capability more than it demands adherence to idealized gender roles. The account books are written in columns of careful characters, recording every transaction, every expense, every movement of goods and silver. Your husband taught you this system years ago, though you've refined it, added your own innovations. You track not just quantities and prices, but also trends over time. Which goods are becoming more valuable? Which markets are showing increased demand? Which suppliers are becoming less reliable? You've created a separate ledger for household expenses, distinguishing between business and personal spending in ways that make taxation less complicated and planning more accurate. The local tax officials have audited your books twice, looking for irregularities, and both times they found nothing to criticize. You took a private satisfaction in their surprised expressions this morning. You're reviewing a contract with a silk supplier from Hangzhou, a city far to the southeast, known for producing some of the finest silk in China. The supplier wants to increase his prices by 15%, claiming that labor costs have risen and that the quality of his product justifies the premium. You've been working with this man for 3 years, or rather, working with his representative here in Chang'an. The relationship has generally been good, but 15% is significant, and you need to decide whether to accept the increase, negotiate for something lower, or find a different supplier entirely. You call for old Chen, who appears within minutes. He's 63 years old, with a thin beard that's gone entirely white and eyes that miss nothing. He's forgotten more about the silk trade than most merchants ever learn. And while he technically serves you, the relationship is more complex than simple hierarchy. He respects your authority, but he also educates you, guides you, sometimes gently corrects you when you're about to make a poor decision. The Hangzhou supplier, you say without preamble. He wants 15% more. What do you think? Old Chen settles onto a stool. You've long since dispensed with the formality of making him stand during these conversations and considers. His quality is excellent, he says finally. We sell his silk to the most demanding buyers, and we've never had complaints. But 15%, he pauses. Have you heard about the new workshops opening in? You have, actually. Suzhou, another city with a reputation for silk, has been expanding its production. You think we should approach them? I think, old Chen says carefully, that the Hangzhou supplier needs to know we have alternatives. Whether we actually change suppliers or not is less important than making sure he understands we could. This is the dance of negotiation, the delicate balance of relationships and leverage that underlies every transaction. You spend the next hour with old Chen planning your approach. You'll send a polite letter to the Hangzhou supplier, acknowledging the quality of his goods, but expressing concern about the price increase. You'll mention, casually, that you've been hearing interesting things about Suzhou production. You'll offer 8% instead of 15%, positioning it as a compromise that recognizes his costs while respecting your budget constraints. And then you'll wait to see how he responds. This is what your days look like, a series of decisions like this, each one requiring judgment about people and markets and timing. You negotiate with suppliers and buyers, trying to get the best terms possible while maintaining relationships that will last beyond any single transaction. You manage the servants, mediating disputes, assigning tasks, occasionally dismissing someone who's proven untrustworthy or incompetent. You maintain connections with other merchant families, visiting back and forth, sharing information, creating the social networks that facilitate business. You attend banquets and gift-giving ceremonies that are ostensibly social but are actually deeply economic. Each gesture weighted with meaning about alliances and obligations. And you do this all while navigating the complicated reality of being a woman in a role that's usually occupied by men. Most of your counterparts, the people you negotiate with, the guild members you interact with, are male. Some of them respect your capability and treat you as an equal. Others are condescending, speaking to you as if you're a child playing at business, their tones patronizing even as they smile. Still others are simply uncomfortable, unsure how to behave around a woman who wields economic power, who sits across from them at negotiating tables and refuses to be intimidated. You've developed strategies for managing these different types. With the ones who respect you, you can be direct and efficient, conducting business without unnecessary social pleasantries. With the condescending ones, you've learned to let them underestimate you. It's actually advantageous sometimes, because they'll reveal more than they intend to or agree to terms they might reconsider if they took you more seriously. With the uncomfortable ones, you try to put them at ease, using humor or self-deprecation strategically, making them feel less threatened by your presence. There's one particular buyer, a man named Wei, who purchases silk for wealthy families in the northern provinces, who falls into the condescending category. He addresses you as little sister, even though you're almost certainly older than he is. And he has a habit of explaining things you already understand, as if imparting great wisdom. 2 months ago, he tried to negotiate a price that was frankly insulting, assuming you wouldn't recognize the attempt to take advantage. You smiled sweetly and told him that your husband had taught you well before he left, and that you couldn't possibly agree to terms that would disappoint your husband upon his return. Wei had looked uncomfortable and revised his offer upward. You'd gotten what you wanted, and he'd saved face by imagining he was dealing with a loyal wife rather than a shrewd businesswoman. Sometimes the performance is part of the strategy, but there are also moments of genuine respect, relationships that transcend gender complications. There's a Persian merchant named Hormuz who trades in glassware and precious stones. He's roughly your husband's age, has been dealing with your family for over a decade, and treats you with the same courtesy and directness he extended to your mother-in-law before her death. Last month, when you were considering a large purchase of glass vessels, Hormuz spent an afternoon teaching you how to evaluate quality, how to check for bubbles and imperfections, how to assess the clarity of color, how to recognize the work of master craftsmen versus ordinary production. He didn't do this to be kind. He did it because he wanted you to appreciate the quality of his goods, to understand why his prices were higher than his competitors. But there was also a mutual respect in the exchange, a recognition that you were both professionals engaged in a common enterprise. You've also built relationships with other merchants' wives, women who occupy similar positions. There's a kind of informal network among you, a community of women managing businesses while husbands travel. You meet for tea, ostensibly for social reasons, but information flows during these gatherings. Someone mentions that a particular official is asking for larger bribes. Someone else warns that a certain supplier has started cutting corners on quality. Another shares that a new market is opening up in a northern city, that there might be opportunities there. You all maintain the fiction that this is merely gossip, merely social chat, but everyone understands the economic value of these exchanges. One of these women, Lady Song, has become something close to a friend. Her husband trades primarily in tea and medicinal herbs, so you're not direct competitors. And she's been managing alone even longer than you have. Her husband has been gone for 14 months this time, traveling all the way to India for some rare herbs that are said to cure ailments ordinary medicines can't touch. Lady Song is 42, childless, and fiercely intelligent. She once told you, over cups of yellow wine that loosened both your tongues, that she sometimes thinks she prefers her husband absent. When he's here, she said, I have to pretend to defer to him, to ask his opinion on decisions I've already made. When he's gone, I can simply do what needs to be done. You understood what she meant, though you're not sure you'd go quite that far yourself. You do miss your husband, his presence, his partnership, the way you work together when he's home. But there's also a freedom in his absence, a clarity of authority that becomes complicated when he returns and you have to renegotiate the division of power, to step back from some decisions while still maintaining your competence and relevance. The financial side of the business requires constant attention. You maintain careful records of income and expenses, tracking the flow of silver through the household. Merchants in Temps China operate in a complex monetary environment, strings of copper cash for everyday transactions, silver for larger deals, occasionally gold for truly substantial purchases, and sophisticated credit instruments that allow for transactions across great distances without moving actual metal. Your husband left you with instructions about which debts to collect, which ones to forgive, which ones to extend. But circumstances change, and you have to make judgment calls based on current information. Last week, a smaller merchant who owed your household a significant sum came to you in distress. His warehouse had been damaged in a fire, and while most of his goods were saved, the loss was enough to put him in serious financial difficulty. He couldn't pay what he owed, not immediately. You had to decide, demand payment anyway, potentially forcing him into bankruptcy. Forgive the debt entirely, taking a loss but earning his eternal gratitude, or find some middle ground. You chose to extend the repayment period by 6 months with modest interest. It was a calculated decision. You believed he'd recover, and having a merchant in your debt could be useful in the future. But it was also an act of mercy, a recognition that any of you could face similar disasters. This is the weight of management, not just the technical skills of accounting and negotiation, but the constant ethical decisions about how to wield economic power. You could be ruthless, extracting maximum profit from every transaction, showing no mercy to those who fall behind. Some merchants operate this way, and they're often financially successful. But you're trying to build something more sustainable, a reputation for fairness that will serve you for decades. In a world where contracts are enforced as much by reputation and relationship as by law, trustworthiness is itself a form of capital. The study is warm now, the afternoon sun slanting through the window. You close the account books, satisfied with the morning's work. Decisions have been made, letters drafted, plans set in motion. The business continues, as it must, regardless of your husband's absence. You've proven to yourself, over and over, that you're capable of this. Not just capable, you're good at it. Better than many men who've had more formal education and more social permission to engage in commerce. Sometimes, you wonder what your life would have been like if you'd been born male. Would you have become a merchant yourself, traveling the Silk Road, seeing all those distant cities? Or would you have chosen the scholar's path, taking the imperial examinations, seeking a career in government? Would you have had more choices, or merely different ones? There's no way to know, and the speculation is pointless. You are who you are, living the life you have, making the best of the particular combination of constraints and opportunities that define your existence. What you do know is this: you're not simply waiting for your husband to return so your real life can resume. This is your real life right now, and you're living it with as much skill and agency as the circumstances allow. The business you manage, the household you run, the decisions you make, these matter. They shape your family's fortune, yes, but they also shape who you are becoming. You are not the same woman who married into this family 8 years ago. That woman was younger, more uncertain, more dependent on others' approval. You've been forged by necessity into someone harder, sharper, more confident. The waiting has not made you passive. If anything, it's made you stronger. The loneliness and the community on the hardest nights. When the compound feels too large and too empty, you walk to the small Buddhist shrine in the corner of your courtyard. The shrine is simpler, wooden cabinet with doors that open to reveal a bronze statue of Guanyan, the bodhisattva of compassion, her serene face illuminated by the butter lamp you light each evening. You kneel on the cushion before the shrine, and in the flickering light, you allow yourself to feel what you spend most of your days pushing away, the loneliness that lives beneath everything else, the ache of absence that no amount of business acumen or household management can fully erase. 7 months is not an unusual separation. You know this. Some merchant wives endure even longer periods alone. Lady Song's husband has been gone for 14 months this time. Another woman, Lady Zhang, hasn't seen her husband in 18 months. His caravan was delayed by political unrest in one of the Western kingdoms, and he's been waiting in Samarkand for safe passage. 18 months. You can barely imagine it, though you know you'd endure it if you had to, just as Lady Zhang is enduring it. What choice do any of you have? But knowing the separation is common doesn't make it easier. Your bed is too large at night, the covers too cold despite the extra quilts. You've grown accustomed to sleeping alone, but accustomed is not the same as comfortable. You still reach out sometimes in the moment between sleep and waking, expecting to find him there, and the jolt of his absence can undo you for hours. You've learned not to linger in that half-awake state. Better to rise immediately, to fill the day with activity, to exhaust yourself so thoroughly that sleep comes as unconsciousness rather than a state where longing can grow. The loneliness is not just physical, though the physical absence is real enough. It's also the loneliness of making decisions without a partner, of carrying burdens that should be shared but rest entirely on your shoulders. When you're weighing whether to accept a risky but potentially profitable deal, you have old Chen's advice, but old Chen is not your husband. He doesn't share your stake in the outcome. The final decision, the final responsibility, is yours alone. When you're worried about some threat, you've heard rumors of bandits becoming more active on certain routes. Political instability in a region your husband should be passing through, there's no one to whom you can fully express your fears without seeming weak or faithless. And then there are the questions you don't speak aloud, even to yourself most of the time, but which surface in these quiet moments before the shrine. Questions about fidelity and trust across distances that can swallow years. Your husband is a man traveling through foreign cities, sleeping in caravanserais and merchant houses, encountering women whose customs are different from your own. You're a woman managing alone in a city full of men, some of whom make their interest obvious despite or perhaps because of your married status. The space between you is not just physical distance. It's also the space where imagination grows, where doubt can flourish if you let it. You choose not to let it, mostly. You choose to believe in the partnership you've built, in the practical ties that bind you beyond romance, shared economic interests, family obligations, the fact that your lives are genuinely intertwined in ways that would be difficult to untangle. But you're also realistic. You know that some merchants maintain multiple households in different cities, wives or concubines in several places along the trade routes. You know that some merchant wives take lovers during their husbands' absences, and that the communities generally maintain a discreet silence about such arrangements, as long as they're handled with proper discretion. You know that the ideal of complete fidelity across months or years of separation is exactly that Tan ideal, maintained more in public performance than in private reality. Your own marriage exists somewhere in the complex space between ideal and compromise. You believe your husband is faithful, or faithful enough. He's never given you specific reason to doubt, though the absence itself is a kind of doubt producer. You know you've attracted attention during his absences. There was a minor official who made his interest quite clear at a banquet last year, and a merchant from the northern provinces who kept finding excuses to visit your compound on business that could have been conducted through intermediaries. You deflected both situations firmly, but without causing offense or embarrassment. You've never seriously considered accepting such advances, not because you're incapable of desire, but because the complications would be enormous and the potential consequences devastating. But the restraint is not always easy. You're 27 years old, healthy, full of vitality that has nowhere to go. There are nights when you miss physical intimacy with an intensity that feels almost painful. When your body remembers pleasures it's been too long without. You deal with this through the strategies available to you: coel baths, exhausting work, meditation before the shrine, and occasionally, in private, the solitary satisfactions that no one discusses but many pursue. It's another reality of your life that exists in the space between public performance and private truth. The emotional loneliness might be hardest of all. You have companions, certainly. Lotus, your senior servant, knows you well enough to read your moods, to know when to speak and when to remain quiet. She's been with you long enough that the relationship has evolved beyond simple mistress-servant hierarchy into something more complex, something closer to friendship, though neither of you would name it that way. You talk to her about things you can't discuss with the other merchant wives. Small domestic worries, fears about your husband's safety, frustrations with business partners who condescend. She listens, and sometimes her responses are surprisingly wise. She's only 3 years older than you, but she seems older, more settled, perhaps because she's never left Chang'an, never had to adjust to the kind of life you're living. The other merchant wives provide community of a different sort. Your gatherings for tea are partly social performance, partly information exchange, but they're also genuinely supportive. These women understand your life in ways that no one else can. They know what it's like to manage businesses alone, to negotiate with men who don't take them seriously, to lie awake worrying about caravans crossing deserts or mountain passes. You don't have to explain yourself to them. They know. Lady Song, especially, has become important to you. She's the one you can be honest with, the one who doesn't judge when you admit to doubts or fears or frustrations. Last month, over wine, you confessed that sometimes you resent your husband for leaving, for building a business that requires these long absences, for choosing a life that demands you sacrifice so much of his presence. Lady Song nodded slowly. I used to feel that way, she said, but then I realized he didn't choose this alone. We all chose it, or it was chosen for us by circumstances, and we chose to stay. We could leave. We could demand they change professions. We don't, because there are things we value more than constant togetherness. The business, the wealth, the status, our own sense of competence and accomplishment. She paused, refilling both your cups. Sometimes I think we're the ones who are really traveling the Silk Road. They just do it physically. We do it in every other way. The Buddhist temple has also become a source of comfort. You're not particularly pious. Your religious practice is more cultural than deeply devotional. But there's something soothing about the rituals, the incense, the chanting of sutras. The temple is only 3 streets away, and you go there perhaps once or twice a week, making offerings, sitting in meditation, talking occasionally with one of the nuns who lives in the attached monastery. Sister Himing is roughly your mother's age. If your mother had lived, she listens when you need to talk, offers perspective from outside the merchant world, reminds you that impermanence is the nature of all things and that attachment causes suffering, though she always says this gently, acknowledging that knowing a truth intellectually and living it emotionally are very different things. The temple is where you encounter the truly cosmopolitan nature of Chang'an's religious life. Buddhism here incorporates influences from India, Central Asia, and indigenous Chinese traditions, creating something that's simultaneously universal and local. You see other merchant wives there, Chinese and foreign. You see servants and officials, the wealthy and the poor. There's a democracy to religious space that doesn't exist in social or commercial contexts, a temporary leveling of hierarchies that feels like relief. Your household itself provides a kind of community, though complicated by the hierarchies of class and employment. You know the servants' names, their stories, their families. You know that Cook's daughter is ill, that old Chun's grandson is preparing for the imperial examinations, that Lotus sends money to her parents in the countryside every month. You're not friends, the power differential is too great for that, but neither are they simply tools you use. They're people whose lives intersect with yours, who depend on your decisions, whose loyalty and competence make your own life possible. Sometimes you think about the irony of your situation. You live in one of the world's largest, most densely populated cities. Your compound is full of people. The neighborhood teems with life. And yet, loneliness is your most constant companion, a presence as real as any human. You're surrounded by people and profoundly alone, managing a life that looks successful from outside but feels, in private moments, like an extended exercise in endurance. But endurance, you've learned, is not nothing. Endurance is actually quite a lot. There's strength in it, a kind of power that comes from proving to yourself repeatedly that you can handle what life demands. Each time your husband leaves and returns and leaves again, each time you manage the business successfully in his absence, each time you navigate the complicated social dynamics of your position, you're building something. Not just wealth, though that too. You're building a self that's more resilient, more capable, more certain of its own competence. The loneliness is real, but so is your agency. So is your skill. So are the relationships that sustain you, even if none of them are quite what you might have wished for. This is the life you have, and within its constraints, you're creating something meaningful. Not the life of constant companionship and presence you might have imagined as a young woman preparing for marriage, but a life nonetheless. A real life with depth and complexity and its own particular forms of satisfaction. You rise from before the shrine, the butter lamp still flickering. Outside, night has fully fallen. The compound is quiet, except for the distant sounds of the city voices from other households. A dog barking, someone playing a flute. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and decisions. But for now, this moment is enough. You're alone, yes, but you're also here, alive, capable, holding everything together. That has to be enough, because it's what you have. And you've learned to find a kind of peace in that acceptance. imperfect as it is, the goods and the stories. When your husband returns, he brings more than silk and silver. He brings stories. And in some ways, the stories are what you crave most. These windows into worlds you'll never see except through his words and the objects he carries across thousands of miles. You've learned to read both the goods and the stories, to understand them as texts that speak of distant places, different lives, the vast and varied world that exists beyond the walls of Chang'an this morning. You're in the main storeroom, taking inventory of goods from his last return, preparing some items for sale and cataloging others for future transactions. Your hands move over a bolt of silk, and you can read its history if you know how to look. This particular piece is raw silk from southern China, purchased from producers near Hangzhou, where the mulberry trees grow thick and the silkworms produce thread of exceptional quality. The color is natural, that pale ivory that raw silk always has before dyeing. Your fingers detect the slight irregularities that mark handwork, the subtle variations that distinguish truly fine silk from the perfectly uniform products that come from the largest, most mechanized workshops. But next to it sits a different kind of silk entirely, one your husband brought from the West rather than sending west. It's Byzantine silk, produced in workshops controlled by the Roman emperors. Though Roman is a complicated term for an empire that's now centered in Constantinople, speaking Greek, practicing Christianity, connected to the original Rome mainly through political fiction and historical memory. The Byzantine silk is dyed a deep purple, the color of royalty, achieved with dye from sea snails harvested in the Mediterranean. The pattern woven into it shows lions and palmettes, designs that speak to different aesthetic traditions than Chinese. Silk patterns with their dragons and clouds. Your husband told you the story of how he acquired this silk. He'd met a Sogdian merchant in Samarkand who'd traveled all the way to Constantinople and back. The journey had taken him 3 years. 3 years of traveling to reach a city that exists at the far western edge of the world, you know. A city that was ancient when Chang'an was young, now the capital of an empire that's itself ancient and decaying, and yet still produces silk fine enough to make your husband willing to trade valuable goods to acquire just this one bolt. Why buy their silk? You'd asked him. We produce better silk here because it's different, he'd said. Because wealthy Chinese buyers will pay premium prices for exotic goods. And nothing is more exotic than silk that traveled all the way from Rome. He'd smiled. And because I wanted to see if they really could produce something worth trading for. They can, not better than ours, but different. Different enough to be valuable. You run your hands over the Byzantine silk now, feeling the subtle distinctions in weave and texture, imagining the workshops where it was made, the hands that wove it, the journey it took to arrive here. Every object in this storeroom has a story like this, a journey, a chain of transactions that brought it across mountains and deserts to this room in Chang'an. There's a section of the storeroom dedicated to glassware, and this is where your education in material culture has been most intensive. Chinese craftsmen can produce ceramic vessels of astonishing beauty and utility, but glass remains largely an imported technology, a skill that exists primarily in the West. The glass vessels your husband brings back are revelations. Clear glass that you can see through completely. Colored glass in shades of blue and green and amber. Glass worked into elaborate shapes that seem impossible given the material's fragility. You pick up a small glass bowl, holding it up to the light that filters through the storeroom door. The glass is pale green, shot through with tiny bubbles that catch the light. It's Roman glass. Though whether from the Western or Eastern territories, your husband couldn't say glass travels along many routes, changes hands many times, until its ultimate origin becomes uncertain. What matters is the object itself, the way light moves through it, the sense of holding something precious and fragile that somehow survived a journey of thousands of miles. Hormuz, the Persian glass merchant, taught you how to evaluate these pieces. Look for clarity first, he'd said, holding a vessel up to sunlight. Bubbles are acceptable, even desirable in some traditions, but the glass itself should be clear, not cloudy. Check for cracks. They can be invisible at first glance, but they'll grow with time. Look at the color. It should be even, not splotchy. And feel the weight. Good glass has a certain heft to it, a density that cheap glass lacks. You'd spent an afternoon learning to see what he saw, training your eyes and hands to distinguish quality from mere prettiness. It was humbling, realizing how much you didn't know, how many layers of expertise exist in every trade. But it was also exciting, adding another skill to your repertoire, another way of reading the world. The precious stones are stored in a locked chest within the storeroom, too valuable to leave casually accessible even in this secured space. You open the chest now, looking at the parcels wrapped in silk, each one containing gems from different regions. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, deep blue stone shot through with gold pyrite that catches light like stars. Carnelian from India, deep red orange, cut into beads and pendants. Jade not from the west, but from the mountains of Khotan, on the edge of the Taklamakan desert. Jade in shades of white and green that Chinese artisans will carve into jewelry and ornaments and ritual objects. Each stone carries its geography with it. Your husband once explained that traders develop an eye for origin, learning to distinguish stones from different regions by subtle variations in color or texture or quality. Lapis from Afghanistan is different from lapis from other places, he'd said. The blue is deeper. The gold flecks are distributed differently. An experienced buyer can tell at a glance. He'd paused. Though an experienced seller can also fool a buyer who's not quite as experienced as he thinks he is. The spices occupy their own corner of the storeroom, stored in sealed ceramic jars to preserve their potency. Pepper from India, so valuable that it's sometimes used as currency. Cinnamon from somewhere in the south. The exact origin is a closely guarded secret by the merchants who control that trade. Cardamom, cloves, saffron, each one a small miracle of flavor and aroma. Each one the product of specific plants grown in specific regions. Each one valuable enough to justify the enormous costs and risks of long-distance trade. You remember the first time your husband brought back pepper and had the cook prepare a dish using it. You'd been skeptical. Why pay so much for something that just makes food spicy? But tasting it changed your understanding. The heat was different from the heat of Chinese peppers, more complex, more interesting. It woke up other flavors, made ordinary dishes extraordinary. You understood, suddenly. Why people would pay absurd prices for these little dried berries from India. But it's not just the goods themselves, it's the stories they carry, the glimpses they provide into distant lives and places. Your husband is a storyteller, and his stories are always better after he's had some wine, when his natural reticence loosens and the memories flow more freely. He tells you about the caravanserais, where the traders sleep. Huge courtyard structures built along the major routes, where merchants from different regions gather for the night. He describes the mixture of languages, the negotiating that happens over meals, the information that's exchanged along with goods, which routes are safe, which officials are demanding larger bribes, which cities are experiencing plague or war. He tells you about the great Central Asian city that serves as a major hub for trade. He describes its markets, its diversity, its wealth built entirely on its position as a crossroads. It's not like Chang'an, he says, smaller, less organized, but in some ways more international. The rulers there understand that their prosperity depends on keeping the trade routes safe and open, so they invest heavily in infrastructure, in maintaining peace with neighboring powers, in creating conditions where merchants want to come. He tells you about the desert, that terrible stretch where water is scarce and sandstorms can kill. He describes what it's like to travel for days, seeing nothing but sand and sky, following routes marked by the bones of previous caravans that didn't make it. He tells you about the relief of finally seeing an oasis, the green of trees and grass that seems impossible after so much emptiness, the way the entire caravan pushes forward with renewed energy when they know water and rest are close. He tells you about the mountain passes, the thin air that makes breathing difficult, the snow that can close routes for months at a time, the local guides without whom no caravan could successfully navigate the terrain. He describes the kingdoms and city-states along the way, each with its own rulers and customs and systems of taxation, each requiring negotiation and gift-giving and careful diplomacy. And sometimes, late at night, when it's just the two of you, he tells you about the danger, the bandits who attacked caravans, sometimes killing everyone, sometimes just taking the goods and leaving the merchants to die slowly of thirst or starvation, the corrupt officials who demand unreasonable bribes, who can destroy a merchant's livelihood with a word, the diseases that sweep through caravans, killing men and animals indiscriminately, the accidents, a camel breaking its leg in terrain where it has to be abandoned, a man falling from a cliff, a tent catching fire and spreading to others before anyone can react. These stories frighten you, but you want to hear them anyway. You want to understand the reality of his life when he's away, want to know what he faces, want to honor the risks he takes, and secretly, you want to feel that you're participating somehow, that by listening and understanding, you're traveling with him in spirit, if not in body. The objects in the storeroom are the physical residue of these stories, the proof that his tales are real. This glass bowl made the same journey he describes. These silk threads were spun and woven by hands in workshops he visited. These spices grew in fields and forests he never saw but that he's connected to through layers of intermediaries. Every object is a node in a vast network of production and trade and transport. And your job is to understand these networks well enough to buy and sell profitably. But beyond the economic function, The objects and stories feed something else: your curiosity about the world, your hunger for experiences you can't have directly. You'll never travel the Silk Road yourself. Women of your class don't make such journeys. It's dangerous, uncomfortable, and socially inappropriate. Your life will be lived within a relatively small geographic radius, Chang'an, and perhaps occasional trips to nearby cities, but never the vast distances your husband travels. This limitation is simply a fact, like the fact of seasons or the need to eat. You don't rage against it most of the time, but sometimes, holding a piece of Byzantine silk or Roman glass, hearing your husband describe a sunset over the desert or a feast in a foreign city, you feel the constraint acutely. You feel the narrowness of your life despite its complexity, the way your world is simultaneously connected to everywhere and confined to here. The goods and the stories are your consolation and your window. Through them, you travel vicariously. Through them, you understand that the world is larger and stranger and more various than you could imagine from your courtyard alone. Through them, you remain curious, engaged, connected to the vast systems of exchange that define this era. You're not traveling, but you're not entirely stationary either. You're somewhere in between, anchored in place, but reaching outward through the objects that flow through your hands and the stories that flow through your mind. This, too, is a kind of journey, not the one you might have chosen if all choices were available, but a journey nonetheless, and one that's yours. Danger and resilience. You try not to think about the families whose men never returned, but their empty houses stand as quiet reminders throughout the quarter. There's one just 3 streets away, a compound that once belonged to a merchant. Family dealing in horses and leather goods from the northern steppes. The husband left 2 years ago with a large caravan, invested heavily in the journey, took risks that seemed calculated at the time. The caravan was attacked somewhere in the western desert. Some men survived and made it back eventually, but he wasn't among them. His widow tried to continue the business for 6 months, but without the expertise and connections her husband had cultivated, without the capital that died with him, she couldn't sustain it. Last you heard, she'd moved back to her birth family. The compound sold to cover debts. Another story of how quickly prosperity can turn to disaster. That could be your story. This is what you understand in the deep places of consciousness where fear lives. Every time your husband leaves, there's a real possibility he won't return. Not a large possibility. Most caravans make it through safely. Most merchants come home, but real nonetheless. Bandits, disease, accidents, political violence, natural disasters. The Silk Road is threaded through with dangers, and no amount of careful planning can eliminate all risks. The waiting would be easier if you could simply not think about it. If you could push the danger out of your mind entirely. But that's not possible, and perhaps it's not even desirable. The danger is real, and pretending otherwise would be a kind of delusion. So instead, you've learned to carry the knowledge of risk without letting it paralyze you, to acknowledge mortality without being consumed by it. This is its own skill, separate from business management or household administration. This is the skill of living with uncertainty while still functioning, still planning, still hoping. You've also learned to prepare for disaster in practical ways. Your husband taught you this before his first long absence after your marriage. Hope I return, he'd said, but prepare as if I might not. It had seemed morbid at the time, this talk of death and disaster when you were young, and he was healthy, and the future seemed limitless. Now you understand the wisdom in it. There's silver hidden in places only you know about, not the household funds that are recorded in account books, but emergency reserves that could sustain you for months if necessary. Some of it is buried in a sealed jar in the garden beneath the pomegranate tree. Some is hidden behind a loose brick in the wall of your sleeping chamber. Your husband knows these locations too, or at least he knew them when he left. You've added a third cache since then, one that's entirely yours. Your own insurance against catastrophe. You've cultivated relationships that extend beyond business, connections that might help you survive if the worst happens. The other merchant wives, certainly you'd help each other, you think, if it came to that, but also certain officials, certain guild members, even some of the servants who've been with the family long enough to feel genuine loyalty. You've been strategic about this, building a network of obligation and goodwill that could be activated in a crisis. You've also thought about what you'd do if your husband didn't return. Not obsessively, not constantly, but you've run through the scenarios in quiet moments. Could you continue the business alone? Yes, you think, at least for a while. You have the skills, the knowledge, the relationships, but it would be harder without his expertise, his reputation, his physical presence in negotiations where gender matters. You might have to take on a partner, perhaps one of the junior merchants who work under your husband's guidance. Or you might narrow the scope of operations, focus on safer, smaller scale trade that you could manage alone. Remarriage is another possibility, though complicated by many factors. As a widow, with property and business acumen, you'd be a desirable match for certain men, perhaps another merchant who'd see the value in acquiring an established enterprise along with a wife. But you'd lose some autonomy in remarrying, have to navigate a new husband's expectations and authority. And if you had children from your first marriage, their inheritance rights would become complicated. You're not sure what you'd choose if faced with the actual decision. It's easier to think about in the abstract, when it remains hypothetical. The worst possibility, the one you push away, but which surfaces anyway in the darkest hours, is total disaster. Husband dead, business collapsed, debts that exceed assets, the entire edifice of your life crumbling. It's possible. It happens. You've seen it happen to others. If it happened to you, you'd probably return to your birth family if they'd accept you. Become a dependent again after years of independence. The thought is almost worse than death, not the physical return, but the psychological regression, the loss of everything you've built and become. But dwelling on worst-case scenarios is paralyzing. So you don't. You acknowledge the possibilities, prepare as best you can, and then you return your focus to the daily work of living. This is the balance realistic enough to prepare, optimistic enough to continue. The merchant quarter has its own stories of resilience, tales that circulate among the families and provide both warning and inspiration. There's an older woman, Lady Lu, whose husband died 15 years ago. She had 3 young children at the time and a business that was heavily indebted. Everyone expected her to fail, to sell everything, and disappear into obscurity. Instead, she consolidated. paid off the debts through a combination of shrewd deals and ruthless economizing, and rebuilt. Her sons are grown now and work with her, but she remains the clear head of the family business. When you're feeling defeated or overwhelmed, you think about Lady Lu. If she could survive and rebuild, perhaps you could too, if necessary. There are also stories of failure, of course. The merchant who misjudged a political situation and found his goods confiscated by a hostile official. The family that borrowed too heavily to finance a journey and couldn't repay when the caravan was delayed by a year. The widow who trusted the wrong partner and discovered too late that he'd been embezzling. These stories circulate to cautionary tales about the many ways things can go wrong. You listen to all of them, the successes and the failures. Try to extract lessons. Be conservative with debt. Diversify your goods and your routes. Maintain good relationships with officials, but never become dependent on any single connection. Keep emergency reserves. Document everything in clear writing so that your affairs could be understood by others if necessary. Trust but verify. Hope for the best. Prepare for the worst. The physical dangers your husband faces are matched by the economic dangers you navigate here in Chang'an. A change in imperial policy could make certain goods illegal to trade overnight. A shift in fashion could make your inventory worthless. A rival merchant could spread rumors that damage your reputation. The guild itself could turn against you if you violated some unwritten rule or offended the wrong person. Economic life is precarious, built on foundations of trust and reputation that can crack suddenly. Last year, there was a scandal involving a prominent merchant family. The husband had been bribing officials to avoid certain taxes, a practice that's common enough but risky. Someone informed on him a rival, probably, or perhaps a disgruntled partner. The officials made an example of him, confiscating his goods, levying enormous fines, essentially destroying the family's business. His wife had known about the bribes, had even facilitated some of them, but she claimed ignorance when the authorities came. Whether they believed her or simply decided she'd been punished enough by her husband's disgrace, they left her alone. She lives in reduced circumstances now, dependent on the charity of other merchant families. You see her sometimes at the market, and the encounter is always awkward. Don't know whether to acknowledge what happened or pretend. Everything is normal. The incident made you review your own practices, made you think carefully about which rules you bend and which ones you follow strictly. Your husband is generally cautious, unwilling to take legal risks for marginal economic gains, and you followed his lead in this. But the temptation is always there, the opportunity to increase profits by cutting corners, avoiding taxes, bribing officials for favorable treatment. Every merchant faces these choices constantly, and the line between acceptable business practice and dangerous corruption is not always clear. You've developed your own ethical framework, your own sense of acceptable risk. You'll give gifts to officials because that's expected, part of the social lubrication that makes business possible. But you won't engage in outright bribery for illegal purposes. You'll be strategic in how you describe goods for taxation purposes, certain aspects, minimizing others, but you won't outright lie about quantities or values. You'll negotiate hard, but you won't deliberately defraud your business partners. This might make you less profitable than some merchants, but it also makes you safer, less vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic exposure that destroyed that other family. The resilience you've developed is not just about surviving your husband's absences or potential disasters. It's also about surviving the daily erosions of dignity, the constant small battles over respect and authority, the ways being a woman in this role means proving yourself repeatedly. Some days you're tired of the merchant who speaks over you in negotiations, tired of the official who addresses his comments to old Chen even though you're the one making decisions, tired of the subtle condescension that underlies so many interactions, but you've learned not to let the fatigue show. You've learned to save your energy for battles that matter, to let small slights pass, to focus on outcomes rather than on being treated exactly as you'd like to be treated. This, too, is resilience, knowing what's worth fighting for and what's not, husbanding your emotional and social capital for situations where it makes a difference. Sometimes you think about the different kinds of courage required in different lives. Your husband needs the courage to face physical danger, bandits, harsh terrain, disease, all the immediate threats of the journey. You need the courage to face uncertainty, the extended suspense of not knowing, the psychological challenge of managing alone while maintaining hope of reunion. Neither is superior to the other. They're just different, each demanding its own particular kind of strength, and you are strong. You know this now, in ways you couldn't have known as a younger woman. The years have tested you repeatedly, and you've passed the tests. Not perfectly, you've made mistakes, had moments of weakness, days when you barely managed to keep going. But you've managed, you've survived, you've adapted and learned and grown. This is what resilience actually means, not being invulnerable, but being able to keep functioning despite vulnerabilities, being able to recover from setbacks, being able to hold on through uncertainty until clarity returns. The empty houses in the merchant quarter stand as reminders of fragility, yes, but your own compound, still occupied, still functioning, still prospering, that stands as a reminder of something else, of possibility, of strength, of the fact that most journeys do end in return, that most risks are survived, that most of the time the mechanisms of business and life continue working even under stress. You live with danger, but you're not defined by it. You prepare for disaster, but you don't let preparation become paralysis. You acknowledge mortality while still fully inhabiting life. This is the bargain, the trade-off. High risk, potentially high reward, uncertainty, but also agency, loneliness, but also independence, danger, but also the fierce satisfaction of surviving it, of proving to yourself again and again that you can handle what life demands. You didn't choose this path entirely, it was chosen for you in many ways by family and circumstance and the limited options available to women of your class and era. But within those constraints, you've made choices, and you've built a life that, for all its difficulties, is genuinely yours. Faith and philosophy in the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep has fled and the day hasn't yet demanded your attention, you find yourself drawn to questions that have no easy answers, questions about fate and choice, about the meaning of this life you're living, about how to make peace with circumstances that shift between your control and beyond it, like sand in wind. These are not idle philosophical musings, they're urgent questions, necessary frameworks for understanding and enduring. And so you've assembled, over the years, a kind of personal theology, drawing from the various spiritual traditions available in cosmopolitan Chang'an, taking what serves you and leaving what Buddhism speaks to you most directly, perhaps because it addresses suffering so honestly. The temple you visit regularly teaches that life is characterized by dukkha, word usually translated as suffering, though it's more subtle than that, more like unsatisfactoriness. The way nothing remains stable, the way even good things contain within them the seeds of their ending. This resonates with your experience. Your husband returns, and it's joyful, but underneath the joy is the knowledge that he'll leave again. The business succeeds, but success creates its own anxieties, its own vulnerabilities. Every achievement is temporary. Every possession is ultimately uncertain. Every relationship is subject to change and loss. The Buddhist answer to this condition is detachment, learning not to cling, not to grasp, not to demand that impermanent things be permanent. But how do you apply this to a life built on attachment? You're attached to your husband, to the business, to the household you manage, to your own role and identity. You can't simply let go of these things without undermining the entire structure of your existence. So you try to find a middle path, being fully engaged with your life while also holding it lightly, caring deeply while also remembering that everything changes, that loss is inevitable, that clinging too tightly causes additional suffering beyond the losses themselves. The nun you speak with occasionally explained it this way: detachment doesn't mean not caring. It means understanding that what you care about is impermanent and loving anyway. It means doing your duty without being destroyed by the outcomes you can't control. This helps, though living it is harder than understanding it. You practice by noticing your own grasping, the anxiety that arises when your husband is overdue, the possessive feeling about the business, the fear of losing what you have. You notice these feelings without judgment, and sometimes, in noticing them, they soften slightly, not disappearing, but becoming more spacious, less controlling. The temple also teaches about karma, the idea that actions have consequences, that what you do now shapes future conditions, that nothing is random, even if causation is too complex to fully trace. This gives you a sense of agency, a feeling that your choices matter, that how you conduct yourself creates the circumstances of your future life and perhaps future lives beyond this one. You try to act with integrity, treating servants fairly, conducting business honestly, being generous when you can afford to be, partly because it's right, but also because you're aware of building something through these actions, creating conditions that will affect you in ways you can't fully predict. But Buddhism is not your only spiritual resource. Taoism offers different teachings, different metaphors that sometimes fit your situation better. The Taoist texts your husband brought home years ago, you've read them repeatedly, finding new meanings with each reading's peak about Wu Wei, action through non-action, achieving goals by aligning with natural patterns rather than forcing outcomes through sheer will. This seems particularly relevant to your life, where so much depends on factors beyond your control. You can't make caravans move faster or make routes safer through force of will. You can't control your husband's decisions or the political situations in distant kingdoms or the weather that closes mountain passes. What you can do is respond skillfully to circumstances as they arise. Position yourself to take advantage of opportunities. Avoid fighting battles that can't be won. You can be like water, the Taoist texts, soft but persistent, flowing around obstacles rather than trying to smash through them, eventually wearing down even stone through patient pressure. This philosophy helps you navigate the merchant world's power dynamics. You can't force men to take you seriously through confrontations that usually makes things worse, but you can flow around their resistance, finding paths that get you where you need to go without direct collision. You can be patient. Let time demonstrate your competence. Let results speak louder than arguments. You can bend without breaking, accommodate without surrendering. This is Wu Wei in practice of action that doesn't look like struggle because it works with circumstances rather than against them. Taoism also offers comfort through its teaching that opposites define each other, that nothing is purely one thing or another. Male and female, presence and absence, activity and rest, joy and sorrow. These aren't absolute categories, but poles that define a spectrum, and each contains seeds of its other. Your husband's absence is painful, yes, but it's also what creates the conditions for your independence and competence. The loneliness is real, but so is the freedom. Understanding this doesn't eliminate the pain, but it helps you hold complexity. To recognize that your life isn't simply good or bad, but a mixture, with each aspect depending on its opposite for meaning. Confucianism is harder for you to embrace wholeheartedly, though it's deeply embedded in the social fabric of Chang'an. The Confucian emphasis on hierarchy, on everyone occupying their proper role, on filial piety and obedience, these teachings don't always serve you well. The Confucian vision of women's roles is quite limited, focused on the domestic sphere, on supporting male authority, on self-effacement and service. If you followed strict Confucian principles, you probably wouldn't be running a business at all. But you can't entirely reject Confucianism either, because it provides the social framework everyone around you operates within. So you take what's useful, the emphasis on education, on self-cultivation, on maintaining social harmony through appropriate behavior, and adapt it to your circumstances. You fulfill your duties as a wife, but you interpret those duties broadly enough to include business management. You maintain the forms of respect and hierarchy, but you also exercise real power within those forms. You perform deference when necessary, but you don't internalize it as defining your actual capabilities or worth. And then there are the folk religious practices, the beliefs that don't belong to any formal tradition but persist because they address needs the higher philosophies sometimes miss. You make offerings to household gods and ancestors, not because you've thought deeply about the theology, but because it's what people do, because it connects you to your family and community, because it provides rituals for marking important moments. When your husband leaves, you make offerings for his safe travel. When he returns, you make offerings of gratitude. These practices are more about creating meaning through action than about believing specific doctrines. You also practice divination occasionally, consulting the I Ching or having fortune tellers read your fate. Intellectually, you're skeptical about whether the future can really be predicted or whether random procedures like throwing coins or reading tea leaves can access meaningful information. But emotionally, you find value in the process. It creates space for reflection, for considering possibilities, for articulating hopes and fears. The fortune teller you visit most often is an older woman, a widow herself, who combines folk wisdom with keen observation. Her predictions often sound more like good advice, cloaked in mystical language, and you don't mind. Sometimes what you need is not knowledge of the future, but permission to acknowledge what you already know in the present. Your personal, religious practice blends all these elements into something that's probably not orthodox in any tradition, but works for you. You go to the Buddhist temple for meditation and philosophical guidance. You read Taoist texts for their wisdom about adaptation and flow. You observe Confucian social rituals because they're expected and sometimes useful. You make folk offerings because they connect you to something larger than yourself. You don't worry too much about theological consistency. You're trying to survive and find meaning, not achieve philosophical purity. Sometimes you wonder what scholars or monks would think of your eclectic approach, your pragmatic borrowing from different traditions. But you're not a scholar or a monk. You're a merchant's wife, managing alone in a complicated world. And you need tools that work, frameworks that help you make sense of your experience. If Buddhism helps you accept impermanence, and Taoism helps you navigate power dynamics, and Confucianism helps you maintain social legitimacy, then you'll use all three. You're building a life, not writing a treatise. The question of fate versus free will occupies your thoughts regularly. Are you living the life you chose, or the life that was chosen for you? The answer seems to be both, simultaneously, in ways that philosophical categories can't quite capture. You didn't choose to be born female in 8th century China. Didn't choose to be born into a merchant family rather than an aristocratic or farming family. You didn't choose the specific man you married. Your parents arranged the match, as was customary, though they consulted your preferences more than some parents might have. You didn't choose your husband's profession or the demands it places on both of you, but within those unchosen circumstances, you've made countless choices. You chose how to respond to your situation rather than being entirely passive. You chose to develop your business skills rather than remaining ignorant. You chose how to treat servants, how to conduct negotiations, which relationships to cultivate. You chose your own ethical boundaries, your own standards of behavior. You choose every day how to interpret your experience, what meaning to give to your life. This is the space of freedom that exists within constraint, and you've learned to value it, to exercise it, to make it count. The ultimate question, the one that surfaces in the darkest moments, says whether this life is enough, whether the meaning you've constructed is genuine or merely a consolation for what you lack, whether you're truly content or just good at convincing yourself you should be. You don't have a final answer to this question. Some days the answer feels like yes, absolutely. This life is rich and meaningful, and you're grateful for it. Other days the answer feels like no. This is a compromise, a making do with less than what you might have wished for if all wishes could be granted. But perhaps the question itself is flawed. Perhaps enough is the wrong standard. Perhaps the point is not to achieve some absolute state of contentment, but to live as fully and skillfully as possible within whatever circumstances you find yourself. Perhaps meaning is not something you discover, but something you create. through attention and intention and the daily work of responding to life with as much wisdom and compassion as you can muster. This is what your assembled philosophy teaches you. Finally, that life is uncertain, that suffering is real but not the whole story, that you have both less control and more agency than you sometimes think, that flexibility is stronger than rigidity, that meaning is made rather than found. These teachings don't eliminate difficulty, but they help you contextualize it, help you understand your experience as part of larger patterns, help you find resources for endurance and occasional transcendence. In the end, you return to the simplest practices, lighting the lamp before Guanyan's image, sitting in quiet meditation, reading texts that have survived centuries because they speak to perennial human concerns, making offerings not because you're sure anyone receives them, but because the act of offering itself is meaningful, trying daily to act with integrity and compassion within the complicated circumstances of merchant life. These practices don't solve the fundamental questions, but they help you live with the questions, which is perhaps the most you can ask. The dawn is breaking now. Light seeping into the courtyard, another day beginning. You rise from your contemplation, return to the practical demands of life. But you carry the philosophy with you, woven into your consciousness, shaping how you move through the world. Faith and philosophy are not separate from daily life. They're the framework that makes daily life bearable, meaningful, occasionally even beautiful, despite its difficulties. And that is enough, or at least it's what you have, which amounts to the same thing in practical terms. The return. And then, one morning, it happens. Servant runs into the courtyard, breathless with news. A runner has arrived at the guild house. Your husband's caravan has been sighted 3 days outside Chang'an. They're safe. They're coming home. The journey is nearly complete. The news hits you with physical force, a rush of sensation that starts in your chest and spreads outward, until your hands are trembling slightly and your breath comes faster. Relief enormous, flooding relief that he's alive, that he's safe, that the months of uncertainty are finally ending. Joy, genuine happiness at the prospect of his return, of the household being whole again, of having him present instead of just imagined. But also something more complicated, an emotion you're almost ashamed to acknowledge, apprehension. After 7 months of managing alone, of being the unquestioned authority in your household, of inhabiting your competence without having to negotiate or share power, his return will change everything. You'll have to make space for him again. We'll have to adjust the rhythms you've established. We'll have to remember how to be a wife instead of just a manager. And you're not entirely sure in this moment whether you're ready for that adjustment. But there's no time for complicated feelings now. There's work to be done. The household must be prepared for his arrival, and preparation is both practical and symbolic. You call all the servants together in the main courtyard and announce the news. The senior servants, Lotus, cook, old Chunsmile, with genuine pleasure. They've known your husband for years, respected him, and his absence has been felt by everyone. The younger servants look less certain. Some of them were hired during his absence and have never met him. They'll meet him now, and the household dynamics will shift again. You issue instructions rapidly, your mind organizing tasks even as you speak. The compound must be thoroughly cleaned, every courtyard swept, every surface dusted, as if preparing for an important guest, even though this is his home. fresh flowers for the main courtyard, the best incense burning in the reception room. His study should be aired out, the account books organized for his review, everything ready for him to step back into his role. The kitchen must prepare a welcoming feast, not overly elaborate, because he'll be tired from travel, but featuring his favorite dishes, the foods he's been missing during months of eating caravan fare. The next 3 days pass in a blur of activity. You oversee the cleaning with exacting standards, because it matters somehow that everything be perfect, that he see the household functioning at its highest level. You review the financial records yourself one more time, making sure every transaction is properly documented, every decision justified and clear. You choose your own clothes carefully, the blue silk robe he brought you last time, because it will please him to see you wearing it, but also because it's beautiful and makes you feel confident. You also visit the Buddhist temple and make an offering of gratitude. Sister Himing is there, and she smiles when she sees you. Your husband returns, she asks, reading your face. 3 days, you say, maybe 2 now. You're happy, she observes, but it's slightly questioning, as if she hears the complexity underneath. Yes, you say, and also, ... Also adjusting is difficult, she finishes. Even good changes require adjustment. The self you've been while he was gone will have to make room for the self you are with him. Both are real. Both are you. But they're different. This is why you come to the temple, for these moments of being understood without having to fully explain. You kneel before the altar, make your offerings, sit in meditation for a while. You try to clear your mind of both anticipation and anxiety. Try to simply be present to this moment before everything changes again. But your thoughts won't settle. They keep jumping ahead to the moment of reunion, trying to imagine how it will feel, what you'll say, whether you'll cry or remain composed, whether the 7 months of absence will fall away immediately or linger as awkwardness between you. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, word comes that the caravan has been spotted on the western road. They'll arrive before nightfall. You're in the main courtyard when you hear supervising the final arrangements, and you have to grip the edge of a stone table for a moment as the news registers. It's really happening. After all these months, he's almost home. You go to your chamber to change into the blue silk robe you've set aside to check your appearance. The woman looking back at you from the bronze mirror is not quite the same woman who said goodbye 7 months ago. You're older, certainly -20-7 now instead of 26. But there's something else, something in your eyes maybe, or the set of your jaw. You look like someone who's been managing alone and managing well. You look competent, confident. You wonder if he'll notice the change, if it will please him or unsettle him. The servants gather in the front courtyard as the sun begins to lower. You stand in the position of honor, with Lotus slightly behind you, old Chen to your left. The other servants arranged in proper hierarchy, waiting, always waiting. But this time, the waiting has an end in sight. You hear the caravan before you see it. Human and animal, the jingle of harnesses, men's voices calling out to each other. And then they're visible, turning the corner onto your street. A long line of camels and horses and men, all dusty from travel, all looking exhausted but relieved to have finally reached their destination. You scan the line for your husband, and there near the front, mounted on his favorite horse. Thinner than you remember, but unmistakably him. Your eyes meet across the distance. He raises a hand in greeting, and you bow slightly in acknowledgement. The formality of it, in front of everyone, feels both necessary and absurd. This is your husband, the man you share a bed with, and yet right now, he's also the master returning home. And there are protocols to be observed. The caravan halts in front of your compound. Your husband dismounts you. Notice he's moving a bit stiffly, probably sore from days of riding, and walks toward you. The servants all bow deeply. He acknowledges them with a nod, but his eyes are on you. He stops a respectful distance away, and for a moment you just look at each other. 7 months compressed into this instant. All the fears and hopes and loneliness and competence and change contained in this looking. Welcome home, you say, and your voice is steady despite everything you're feeling. It's good to be home, he replies. And then, dropping some of the formality, you look well. So do you say, which is only partly true. He looks exhausted and wind-worn, and he's definitely lost weight. But he's alive and safe and home, and that's what matters. The reunion proceeds according to proper form. He greets old Chen, inquires after the household's welfare, gives instructions about unloading the goods. You walk beside him as he moves through the compound, showing him that everything has been maintained, that all is in order. He nods approval, asking occasional questions, and you answer them clearly, demonstrating your competence without seeming to boast. Only when you're finally alone in your chamber does the formality drop away. He closes the door and turns to you, and suddenly you're in his arms, holding him tightly, feeling the reality of his physical presence after months of absence. He smells like dust and sweat and horses, completely different from his usual scent. But underneath is something familiar, something that's unmistakably him. You bury your face against his shoulder and let yourself feel everything you've been holding back, the relief, the love, the complicated joy of his return. I missed you, he says quietly, his breath warm against your hair. I missed you too, you reply, and it's true, despite everything else. Despite the complexity of what his absence has meant. You stay like that for a long moment, just holding each other, reconnecting through touch in ways that words can't quite manage. Eventually, you separate enough to look at each other properly. His face is more weathered than you remember. New lines around his eyes from squinting in desert sun. His hands are rougher, more calloused. He's examining you, too. You realize, noticing changes. You look different, he says. Not critically, just observing. So do you reply. No, I mean, you look more. He searches for words. More certain, like you've grown into something while I was gone. You're surprised, he noticed, and pleased. I've been managing, you say, the business, the household, everything. I know, he says. Old Chen sent updates through the runners. He said, you've done remarkably well. Better than well, actually. He said you've improved systems he's been using for 20 years. You feel a flush of pride at this recognition. I hope you don't mind that I made changes, mind. He laughs, and the sound is wonderful after 7 months of not hearing it. Why would I mind? This is as much your household as mine. More, maybe, considering how much time I spend away from it. This acknowledgement means more than he probably realizes. You've been acting with authority during his absence. But there was always some uncertainty about whether he'd approve, whether he'd see your initiatives as overstepping, knowing that he respects what you've done, that he sees you as a genuine partner rather than just a caretaker in his absence. This settles something in you that you didn't fully realize was unsettled. The feast that evening is a joyful affair. The caravan members who live in Chang'an go to their own homes, but several stay for dinner. Business partners, employees who don't have families here, men who've become friends over years of traveling together. The main courtyard fills with noise and laughter and storytelling. Your husband holds court, describing highlights of the journey, and you watch him fall back into this role: the successful merchant, the experienced traveler, the man who's seen things others haven't. You've missed this version of him too, the public person as well as the private one. But you're also aware of sitting slightly apart from it all, observing rather than fully participating. The men's stories are about adventures and dangers you didn't experience, about places you'll never see. You contributed to making this journey possible. Your management here enabled his travels there. But that contribution is invisible in these tellings. This doesn't bother you exactly, but you notice it. This distinction between the journey and the staying, between the one who goes and the one who waits. Later, much later, when the guests have departed and the servants have cleared the feast's remains and the compound has settled into night's quiet, you and your husband finally have true privacy. The physical reunion is both familiar and strange. You know each other's bodies, but 7 months have made you slightly shy, slightly uncertain of rhythms and responses. You relearn each other slowly, and there's tenderness in this relearning, a gentleness that acknowledges the time apart. Afterwards, lying in the darkness, he talks. He tells you about the journey in ways he didn't at dinner, the scary parts, the lonely parts, the moments of doubt about whether this life is sustainable, whether the rewards justify the costs. He talks about missing you, missing home, missing the simplicity of daily routines in one place. He talks about getting older. He's 33 now and wondering how many more of these journeys he can make before age or health or simply weariness makes them impossible. You listen, holding his hand in the darkness. And then you talk too, telling him about the challenges of managing alone, about the decisions you made and the uncertainty you felt, about the loneliness, but also the growth, the way you've discovered capabilities you didn't know you had. You're more honest than you've been before about the complexity of your feelings, about how his absence is both difficult and in some ways liberating, about how his returns require adjustment. That's not always easy. He's quiet for a while after you finish speaking. Then, "I'm glad you told me that. I've always wondered if I was being fair to you, building a life that requires so much absence. But I didn't know how to ask without making it seem like I was fishing for reassurance." "Are you?" you ask. "Fishing for reassurance?" "Maybe a little," he admits. "I know this life is hard on you. I just hope it's also worthwhile, that you find something valuable in it beyond just enduring." You consider this carefully before answering, because it's important to be honest. "It's worthwhile," you say finally. "Not in the way I might have imagined when we married, but I've become someone I respect through living this life. I've developed skills I value. I've built relationships I treasure. It's not easy, but it's mine. Does that make sense?" "Yes," he says quietly. "Yes, it does." You fall asleep in his arms, and it feels both deeply right and slightly unfamiliar. This presence beside you, after so many months alone, tomorrow will bring its own adjustments, negotiating shared authority again, figuring out how to work together after you've worked alone, remembering how to accommodate another person's needs and preferences. The cycle will continue. He'll be home for a while, perhaps 6 months, and then he'll leave again, and you'll manage alone again, and eventually he'll return again. This is the pattern of your life, and tonight, exhausted and relieved and grateful, you accept it. Word count, 1,500 words, exactly. Continuing with section 9, closing reflection. What this life means in the weeks following his return. As the household settles back into its different rhythm, you find yourself reflecting on what this life has taught you about yourself, about partnership, about the particular ways women create meaning and exercise power in a world that limits their official options. These reflections come in quiet moments, in the spaces between activity. When you're watching him conduct business that you managed in his absence, when you're reviewing account books together, when you're simply sitting in the courtyard, watching seasons change, you understand now what you couldn't have known as a younger woman preparing for marriage, that this life of waiting and managing, of absence and return, of holding things together while your husband travels, this is not a passive existence at all. It's a different kind of journey, one that happens largely in place, but that's no less real for its lack of geographic movement. You've traveled through emotional landscapes, through challenges that required navigation and courage, through territories of competence and independence that you might never have explored if your husband had stayed home. The woman you've become is not the woman you would have become if your life had been different. This seems obvious, but the implications go deep. You're more capable, more confident, more resilient than you might have been. You know how to manage complex business operations, how to negotiate with men who don't want to take you seriously, how to maintain authority while still observing social proprieties. You know how to endure uncertainty, how to make decisions under pressure, how to balance short-term needs against long-term planning. These are not small skills. They're the capacities that define effective leadership, and you've developed them because necessity demanded it. But you've also paid prices for this development. You've experienced loneliness that never fully heals, uncertainty that never fully resolves. You've learned to live with constant low-level anxiety about your husband's safety, with the knowledge that any goodbye might be the last one, with the reality that your life is built on foundations that could crack suddenly. You've had to become harder in some ways, less vulnerable, more guarded. You've had to develop a kind of emotional self-sufficiency that serves you well, but that also makes full intimacy more difficult when your husband returns. Sometimes you think about alternative lives, the paths not taken or not available. What would your life be like if you'd married a local merchant who never left Chang'an? More stable, certainly. More emotionally secure, more conventional. You'd probably have children by now. You and your husband have discussed this. The fact that his long absences make pregnancy more difficult, that even if you conceived, raising children would be largely your responsibility alone. You've chosen, together, to wait, to establish the business more firmly before adding that complexity. But waiting means you're now 27, and each year that passes makes children less likely. This too is a cost, though one you've accepted consciously? Or what if you'd been born into a different class entirely? As a scholar official's wife, you'd have different constraints, different expectations, more social status, perhaps, but probably less economic agency, more security, but less independence. The merchant class occupies a strange position in Temp's society, prosperous but not prestigious, wealthy but not powerful in official terms, free from some aristocratic constraints but subject to others. For a woman, this position has both advantages and disadvantages. You have more room to exercise capability than you might in a more rigid, aristocratic context. But you also lack the protections and status that aristocratic women enjoy. You think about the question of choice again, that perennial puzzle about how much of your life you've chosen versus how much has chosen you. And you've come to believe that the question itself might be less important than what you do with the situation you find yourself in. You didn't choose to be born in 8th century China, didn't choose your gender or your family's class, or even, in any meaningful sense, your husband. But you've chosen how to respond to these givens. You've chosen to develop skills rather than remaining ignorant. You've chosen to take your responsibilities seriously rather than treating them as burdens to be minimized. You've chosen to find meaning in circumstances that could have been merely endured. This, choosing within constraint, is its own form of freedom, more limited than absolute freedom, but more real than no freedom at all. It's the freedom available to most people in most times, not the freedom to escape all limits, but the freedom to shape your response to those limits, to create meaning and purpose and dignity within whatever circumstances you're given. And this is enough, or it has to be, because it's what's actually available. You think about your husband, too, about the partnership you've developed over 8 years of marriage. It's not a romantic partnership in the sense that storytellers might celebrate her, not constantly together, not sharing daily life in the way that couples with more conventional arrangements do. But it's a real partnership nonetheless, built on mutual respect and shared purpose and the practical necessities of managing a complex enterprise together. You trust each other, rely on each other, have developed ways of working together that accommodate both his traveling and your managing. And there's affection too, genuine love, even though it's a love that's been shaped by absence into something more durable than passionate. You love him when he's gone as well as when he's present. Love him as an idea and a memory as well as a physical reality. You love the partnership you've built, the way you complement each other's strengths, the way you've learned to navigate the challenges of your unusual situation. This might not be the all-consuming romance of poetry, but it's something more sustainable, more adult, more suited to actual life than ideal. You think about the other women in the merchant quarter, the network of wives who manage while their husbands travel. You've come to understand that you're part of a much larger system, one that's essential to the functioning of the Silk Road trade, but largely invisible in official histories. History records the travelers, the men who move goods across continents, the merchants who negotiate deals in foreign cities. It rarely records the women who manage the home bases, who maintain the networks and relationships that make those journeys possible, who hold things together during absences that can last for years. But you're here. All of you are here. Lady Song, Lady Zhang, Lady Liu, dozens of others whose names you know or don't know. women managing businesses and households, and lives in the spaces between men's departures and returns. You're the infrastructure that enables the trade, the stability that allows the movement. Without you, the Silk Road wouldn't function, because merchants need secure bases, need someone to manage their affairs at home, need the continuity that you provide. Your work is essential, even if it's not celebrated or officially recorded. This realization gives you a different kind of pride, a sense of participating in something larger than your individual life. You're not just managing your household. You're part of the machinery that connects China to Central Asia, to Persia, to distant Rome. The silk that passes through your storeroom travels to places whose names you barely know. The silver that fills your account books has traveled equally far to reach you. You're a node in a vast network, and while you're confined to one place geographically, you're connected to the world through the goods and stories and relationships that flow through your compound. You think about what you want your legacy to be, if you have one. You probably won't be remembered beyond your immediate descendants, if you have any. You're not going to be recorded in histories or commemorated with monuments. But maybe that's not the right way to think about legacy. Maybe legacy is what you pass on to the people whose lives you've touched, the servants you've treated fairly, the business partners you've dealt with honestly, the other merchant wives you've supported through difficult times. Maybe legacy is the household you've maintained, the business you've helped build, the example you've set of competent management and ethical conduct. And maybe legacy is also what you've proven to yourself, that you're capable of much more than anyone might have expected, that you can handle responsibility and uncertainty and independence, that you can create meaning and purpose in circumstances that weren't entirely of your choosing. These are not small achievements. They might not be publicly celebrated, but they're real. The afternoon light is slanting across the courtyard now, golden and warm. Your husband is in his study, reviewing some contracts. Cook is preparing dinner. Lotus is supervising the younger servants in their evening tasks. Old Chen is in the storeroom, conducting one of his meticulous inventories. The household is functioning. The business is operating. Life continues in its complex patterns, and you're at the center of it. Not because you demanded to be, but because you've made yourself essential through competence and commitment. This is your life, not the life you might have imagined. Not the life that stories celebrate, but a real life nonetheless, with depth and meaning and its own particular dignities. You've learned to live with absence, to thrive in uncertainty, to find strength you didn't know you had. You've learned that waiting is not passive, that staying can be its own form of journeying, that power doesn't always look like what you expect. You've learned, finally, that you're enough. Not perfect, who've made mistakes, had moments of weakness, days when you barely managed, but enough. Capable enough, strong enough, resourceful enough to handle what life demands. This knowledge is hard-won, and it's yours, and no one can take it from you. The Silk Road stretches west from Chang'an, carrying goods and people and stories across continents. But there's another road too, the one you've traveled, a road that goes inward and forward, through emotional territories and personal growth, through loneliness and competence, and the daily work of creating meaning. This road doesn't appear on any map, but it's as real as any physical route, and in its own way, just as important. You stand, finally, because sitting still has become unnecessary. The reflections will continue, they always do. These quiet considerations of meaning and purpose. But for now, there's work to be done. A household to run, a business to manage, a life to live. You move toward the work with the confidence of someone who knows what they're doing, who's proven themselves repeatedly, who's earned their place in this complicated world. History will mostly forget you, but you won't forget yourself. You'll remember who you became, how you grew, what you learned about strength and resilience, and the particular courage required to build a life in the spaces between someone else's journeys. You'll remember the merchant wives who traveled the Silk Road without ever leaving home, who held things together while their husbands moved through the world, who were essential even though they were invisible. Thank you for listening to this story tonight. If it helped you see history differently, if it opened a window into a life you might not have considered, if you simply enjoyed traveling to Temp's China with me, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. History is full of these forgotten stories, these essential but unrecorded lives, and each one deserves to be remembered and honored as you settle into sleep tonight. Perhaps you can carry with you the image of that merchant's wife in her courtyard, managing her life with grace and competence, proving that staying can be as courageous as traveling, that the daily work of holding things together is its own form of heroism. Until next time, rest well and remember that your own life, with all its ordinary challenges and quiet strengths, is part of history too, worth recording, worth remembering, worth living fully.